For 2 decades, he kept 2 pregnant sisters, becoming the most consanguineous and feared monster of the Appalachians. Hidden for decades in the mist-shrouded depths of the mountains, where the winds whistle through the pines is the only sound to break the silence, lies one of American history's most disturbing cases. This is the tale of Ezekiel Blackwood, a man who transformed his own family into a grotesque genetic experiment, hidden from society's eyes for nearly 20 years between 1938 and 1958. The Appalachian Mountains, with their remote communities and isolated valleys, have always been known for keeping secrets. But in McDowell County, Western Virginia, these secrets grew darker than anyone could have possibly imagined. It was in this region, known for its extreme poverty and coal mines during the Great Depression, that the Blackwood family established its property, far from everyone and everything. The Blackwood property lay at the end of a dirt road that was nearly impassable, surrounded on all sides by dense, untamed forest. The main house was an old, 2-story wood construction that remained partially hidden by century-old trees. Around it, small makeshift huts served as extensions, forming a family complex utterly isolated from the rest of the world. Born in 1905, Ezekiel Blackwood was the son of miners who died when he was just 12 years old. Raised by a distant and abusive uncle, he developed a reclusive and authoritarian personality. In 1930, he inherited the family property and brought his 2 younger sisters, Martha and Ruth, then aged 18 and 16, to live with him. The 3 siblings lived in isolation, with very little contact to the local community. What no one could have known was that behind those worn wooden walls, Ezekiel was beginning to implement a distorted vision of family preservation, a vision that would culminate in a genetic nightmare of unimaginable proportions. He had a very peculiar theory, explains Dr. Thomas Morgan, a historian who specializes in the isolated communities of the Appalachians. Based on a distorted understanding of genetics and influenced by eugenic ideas that were circulating at the time, Ezekiel believed that mixing family blood would strengthen certain characteristics he considered superior. He became obsessed with the idea of creating a pure Blackwood lineage. The first pregnancy of Martha Blackwood occurred in 1938. At the time, the nearest neighbors, who lived more than 5 kilometers away, believed she had married a man from another town. No one ever saw this supposed husband, but the explanation was accepted without question, as was common in that time and region, where privacy was respected almost like a religion. People in that place and at that time lived by an unspoken code, says 93-year-old Eliza Jenkins, one of the few living people who had any contact with the Blackwoods. You minded your own business and let others mind theirs. That's how we survived in the mountains. What Eliza and the others didn't know was that there was no husband. Martha was carrying the child of her own brother, Ezekiel, the beginning of a macabre plan that would last for more than 2 decades. Less than a year later, Ruth also became pregnant. Once again, the story of a marriage to an outside man was spread to explain the situation. But within that isolated property, the 2 sisters had become prisoners of their own brother, forced to bear children in a distorted attempt to raise what Ezekiel called the perfect Blackwood lineage. Records found decades later reveal that between 1938 and 1958, Martha gave birth to 9 children, while Ruth had 7. 16 children born from consanguineous unions, condemned before they even entered the world. What we need to understand is that while knowledge about the effects of consanguinity existed at that time, it was not widespread, especially in isolated rural communities, explains Dr. Caroline Fisher, a geneticist from West Virginia. While marriages between cousins were relatively common in some rural areas until the mid-20th century, unions between siblings were universally taboo. Ezekiel was not just ignoring social norms, he was deliberately challenging them based on his own distorted theories. The genetic consequences would be devastating. Of the 16 children born, records indicate only 11 survived beyond early childhood. Among the survivors, serious health problems were the rule, not the exception. When we talk about close consanguinity, like between siblings, we are facing a scenario where harmful recessive genes have a much greater probability of manifesting, Dr. Fisher continues. This can result in a variety of conditions, from congenital heart problems to severe intellectual deficiencies and physical deformities. Martha's first child, Joseph, born in 1938, appeared healthy in his early years, giving Ezekiel false confirmation of his theories. However, as more children were born, the problems began to manifest themselves more and more evidently. Martha's fifth son, born in 1945, had a severe cardiac malformation and died before turning 2. Ruth's third daughter was born with polydactyly, possessing 6 fingers on each hand. To keep his terrible secret, Ezekiel rarely allowed the children to leave the property. The few who were occasionally seen in the nearest town were always accompanied by Ezekiel himself, who would explain their unusual appearances as the result of a family disease. This extreme isolation was crucial for the horror to continue for so long. Ezekiel controlled every aspect of life on the property. He was the only one who went to town to buy supplies and interact with the outside world. Effectively prisoners, Martha and Ruth cared for the children and kept the property running under their brother's vigilant eye. The control he exercised was absolute, says Dr. Morgan. Based on diaries found later, we know Ezekiel kept a meticulous record of every pregnancy, every birth, even the physical characteristics each child developed. It was as if he were conducting a horrible experiment, using his own family as guinea pigs. The isolation, the widespread poverty of the region, and a natural distrust of outsiders created the perfect environment for this situation to continue undetected for almost 2 decades. The few people who occasionally suspected something was wrong hesitated to get involved, following the unspoken code of the mountains not to interfere in the affairs of others. Check now if you are already subscribed to this channel. If you wish to unravel humanity's darkest secrets, the ones they will never teach in schools, this is your opportunity to dive into the abyss of the human condition with our exclusive investigations. The environment where the Blackwood children grew up was a separate world, isolated and governed by Ezekiel's distorted laws. The property, with its approximately 15 hectares of rugged land, had become a microcosm where the rules of society did not apply. Over the years, as the number of children grew, Ezekiel expanded the property's facilities. Small cabins were built around the main house, creating a kind of isolated community. The older children helped care for the younger ones, forming a complex and dysfunctional hierarchy. Joseph, the firstborn from 1938, assumed a position of authority second only to Ezekiel's. Seemingly without serious physical deformities, he nonetheless developed significant behavioral problems. Subsequent reports from neighbors describe a young man of erratic behavior, alternating between periods of extreme docility and violent explosions of anger. What we see in Joseph's case is a classic example of the neurological effects that can result from consanguinity, explains Dr. Robert Patterson, a neuropsychiatrist at the University of Pittsburgh. Studies show that children from close consanguineous relationships have a higher likelihood of developing neurochemical imbalances that affect behavior, even without obvious physical deformities. Rebecca, Ruth's first daughter, born in 1939, had a condition known as heterochromia, eyes of different colors, one blue and one brown. While this condition itself isn't necessarily a result of consanguinity, in her case it was accompanied by a severe hearing impairment. Despite these limitations, records suggest Rebecca developed a remarkable intelligence, creating a system of communication with the other children. Daily life on the Blackwood property followed a rigorous routine established by Ezekiel. The children were awakened before dawn to perform chores on the small farm that guaranteed the family's livelihood. They cultivated potatoes, corn, and beans, and kept some chickens and pigs. Formal education was virtually non-existent, limited to the little that Martha and Ruth could teach. It's important to understand the context of the time, says historian Dr. Morgan. In the rural areas of the Appalachians during that period, it was not uncommon for children to receive little or no formal education. Child labor on family farms was the norm, not the exception. This helped camouflage the Blackwood situation, as the children's educational isolation didn't arouse suspicion. The children's health was precarious. Without access to proper medical care, many treatable conditions became chronic and debilitating. Martha's third daughter, Eleanor, born in 1942, developed severe scoliosis that, left untreated, resulted in a spinal deformity that limited her movement. Even so, records indicate she worked in the medicinal herb garden that Martha kept, learning to use local plants to treat common ailments. The use of traditional herbal medicine was common in the rural Appalachian communities, explains Dr. Margaret Wilson, an expert in ethnobotany. Many of these communities were days away from the nearest doctor, so they developed a deep knowledge of the medicinal properties of local plants. In the case of the Blackwoods, this knowledge was probably crucial for the survival of many of the children. The twins Thomas and Timothy, born to Ruth in 1944, represent a particularly tragic case. Both were born with a cleft lip and palate, conditions that made feeding and speech difficult. Timothy, who also had a deformity in his left leg, died at age 4 after contracting pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. Thomas survived but developed a severe speech impediment that isolated him even further within the already isolated environment. As the children grew older, Ezekiel implemented the most disturbing aspect of his plan, the continuation of the consanguinity cycle. When Joseph turned 16 in 1954, Ezekiel began preparing him to assume what he called family responsibilities. In his diaries, found decades later, Ezekiel described in clinical and disturbing detail how he planned for Joseph to strengthen the lineage with his own half-sisters once they reached the proper age. What we see here is the perpetuation of a cycle of intergenerational abuse, says Dr. Helen Richards, a psychologist specializing in family trauma. Ezekiel wasn't just imposing his control over his sisters, he was planning to extend that control to the next generation, creating a legacy of trauma that could have continued indefinitely had it not been interrupted. The family's isolation was maintained through a combination of fear and misinformation. The children were taught from an early age that the outside world was hostile and dangerous. Ezekiel reinforced this belief by telling exaggerated or completely fabricated stories about people who were persecuted or killed for being different, creating an obvious parallel to his own children's situation. This kind of manipulation is a classic tactic in coercive control situations, explains Dr. Richards. By convincing victims that the outside world is more dangerous than the abusive environment, the perpetrator eliminates the possibility of escape or seeking help. In the case of the Blackwoods, this isolation was particularly effective due to the remote location and limited social interaction. As the 1950s advanced, the situation on the Blackwood property became increasingly unsustainable. The growing number of children, many with significant medical needs, strained the family's limited resources. Martha, after 9 pregnancies in precarious conditions, suffered from severe health problems. Ruth, younger, continued the cycle of forced pregnancies, giving birth to her 7th child in 1956. Living conditions deteriorated visibly. The main house, never properly maintained, began to have serious structural problems. During the particularly severe winter of 1956 to 1957, reports indicate the family was forced to congregate in only a few rooms of the main house to conserve heat, creating conditions of overcrowding and unhealthiness. It was in this context of growing deterioration that events began to move toward the inevitable moment when the outside world would finally discover the horrors of the Blackwood property. The catalyst for this discovery would be a desperate decision made by Rebecca, then 18, a decision that would forever change the family's fate. What happened on the Blackwood property represents one of the most extreme cases of documented isolation and consanguinity in the modern history of the United States, concludes Dr. Morgan. It is a disturbing case study in how geographical isolation, poverty, and authoritarian control can create the conditions for systematic abuse to remain hidden for decades. The year 1957 marked the beginning of the end for Ezekiel Blackwood's reign of terror. The winter of that year was particularly brutal in the Appalachian Mountains, with temperatures reaching -30 degrees and snowfalls that further isolated the already remote Blackwood property. It was during this winter that Rebecca, then 18, began to plan her escape. Despite her hearing impairment, she had developed a keen understanding of the world around her and knew intuitively that the situation in which they lived was not normal. The diaries she kept secretly, found years later, reveal a young woman who, even raised in extreme isolation, had developed her own moral conscience and an unshakable determination. Rebecca represented an anomaly within the closed system created by Ezekiel, explains Dr. Richards. Despite all attempts at isolation and indoctrination, she developed a critical perspective on her situation. This is not uncommon among survivors of abusive environments. Even in the most extreme situations, human resilience can manifest in surprising ways. Rebecca's plan was bold, considering her limited understanding of the outside world. For years, she had collected and hidden small, useful objects, a pocket knife, matches, pieces of rope, and even a rudimentary map of the county she had found in an old book in the house. She also secretly saved food from meals, drying it to preserve it. The opportunity came in February 1957, during one of Ezekiel's rare trips to town for supplies. Normally, he would take Joseph with him, but this time he decided to leave him behind to help fix the roof of a cabin that had collapsed under the weight of the snow. With Ezekiel absent and Joseph busy, Rebecca seized her chance. Taking only a small bundle with her few belongings and provisions, she escaped into the forest in the middle of a snowfall, the bad weather helping to cover her tracks. What followed was an epic and desperate journey. For 3 days, Rebecca wandered through the snow-covered mountains, guided by the sun during the day and the stars at night, as she had learned from observing Ezekiel. Without proper equipment and facing freezing temperatures, she suffered from hypothermia and severe frostbite on her extremities. When we think about what Rebecca faced, it's almost unbelievable that she survived, says Dr. William Harper, a remote medicine expert. A young woman with a hearing impairment, with no experience of the outside world, crossing one of the most inhospitable regions of the Appalachians during a blizzard, the odds were minimal. Her survival speaks volumes about her willpower. On the morning of the 4th day, Rebecca was found by a local hunter, Edgar Thompson, who initially mistook her for an injured animal. Semi-conscious and suffering from advanced hypothermia, she was rushed to the small clinic in Welsh, the nearest town. What followed was the slow unraveling of a horror that the local community could barely comprehend. Unable to speak due to exhaustion and her hearing limitations, Rebecca initially communicated through rudimentary drawings. It was a nurse, Sarah Collins, who finally established an effective communication system with the young woman. "I will never forget the moment I understood what she was trying to tell us," Collins said years later in an interview with the local newspaper. "At first I thought it was a bad joke, that it was impossible. But the more she explained, the clearer it became that we were facing something truly horrible." The local sheriff, initially skeptical Frank Miller, organized a short expedition to the Blackwood property to investigate Rebecca's allegations. What they found confirmed their worst fears. 15 people living in deplorable conditions, many with visible deformities and significant signs of neglect. "It was like entering another world," said Deputy James Wilson, who accompanied the sheriff on that first visit. The main house was in a state of advanced decay. The smell of mold and sickness was oppressive. The younger children looked at us as if they had never seen strangers before. Some hid, others were paralyzed with fear. Ezekiel, surprised by the authorities' arrival, initially tried to explain the situation as a case of an unusual family who preferred to live in isolation. When confronted with Rebecca's specific allegations, he became aggressive and tried to resist arrest. It took several deputies to subdue him. Martha and Ruth, after decades of abuse and isolation, showed clear signs of deep psychological trauma. Initially, they defended Ezekiel, behavior typical of prolonged abuse victims. It was only after weeks of medical care and counseling that they began to speak about the horrors they had faced. The Blackwood case challenged all existing protocols at the time, explains Dr. Linda Peterson, a historian specializing in rural social services. In 1957, the social service system in rural areas was virtually non-existent. There was no precedent for dealing with a case of this magnitude and complexity. The local community, medical services, and authorities had to improvise, creating responses as they went along. The story of the Blackwood family exploded in the local media and eventually attracted national attention. Newspapers of the time portrayed the case with a mixture of genuine horror and morbid sensationalism. Headlines like "Horror Family in the Mountains" and "The Appalachian Secret" dominated the front pages. If you are feeling impacted by this story, leave it in the comments. May justice be done for the victims of the Blackwoods. Your voice is important to show that we do not tolerate such atrocities, even decades later. For the Blackwood children, the rescue represented a new kind of trauma. Suddenly exposed to a world they did not understand, many exhibited severe difficulties with adaptation. The authorities struggled to determine what to do with them, as there were no adequate facilities for their specific needs. The system was simply not prepared for such a case, continues Dr. Peterson. There were no institutions specialized for children with multiple deficiencies resulting from consanguinity. The options were limited to general orphanages or psychiatric institutions, none of which were suitable for their needs. The discovery of the Blackwood family also raised unprecedented legal issues. Ezekiel was arrested and charged with multiple crimes, including kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and other offenses. However, the laws of the time did not specifically contemplate the type of systematic, multigenerational abuse he had perpetrated. The Blackwood case revealed significant gaps in the legal system, explains Dr. Harold Jenkins, a professor of historical criminal law. Prosecutors had to be creative in applying existing laws. This case would eventually contribute to the evolution of legislation related to family abuse and child neglect in the following decades. Ezekiel Blackwood's trial, held in 1958, was one of the most sensational in the history of Western Virginia. Although his lawyers tried to plead insanity, Ezekiel was found mentally capable of standing trial. The testimonies of Martha and Ruth, though painful, were crucial to his conviction. The trial records reveal a man who, to the end, believed he was justified in his actions, says Dr. Jenkins. Ezekiel would often interrupt the proceedings to explain his theories about genetic purity and the superiority of his family lineage. His apparent lack of remorse shocked even the most experienced court observers. Ezekiel Blackwood was sentenced to multiple consecutive prison terms, ensuring he would remain behind bars for the rest of his life. He died at the West Virginia State Penitentiary in 1972, apparently without ever showing remorse for his actions. For Martha and Ruth, the rescue brought a freedom that initially seemed as frightening as their captivity. After receiving extensive medical treatment, the two sisters were gradually reintegrated into society. Martha, whose health had been severely compromised by 9 pregnancies in precarious conditions, never fully recovered. She lived her final years in a nursing home in Charleston, where she died in 1975 from heart complications. Ruth, being younger and having suffered less physical damage, experienced a more substantial recovery. With the help of social programs and the support of local religious groups, she eventually learned to read and write and spent her last years working as a volunteer at a shelter for women victims of domestic violence. She died in 1988, having dedicated 3 decades of her free life to helping other women escape abusive situations. Ruth's story represents a remarkable testament to human resilience, says Dr. Richards. After decades of unimaginable abuse, she not only survived but found a purpose in helping other victims. Her journey reminds us that even after the most severe trauma, recovery and transformation are possible. The consequences of Ezekiel Blackwood's distorted genetic experiment extended far beyond the initial rescue of the children in 1957. For the 11 surviving children, the impact of extreme consanguinity would shape the rest of their lives, creating medical, psychological, and social challenges that the science of the time barely began to understand. The Blackwood case represents one of the first documented studies of extreme multigenerational consanguinity in the United States, explains Dr. Edward Roberts, a geneticist at Johns Hopkins University. From a scientific viewpoint, it provided valuable insights into the effects of severe endogamy on humans, albeit at an unacceptable human cost. Initial medical evaluations of the Blackwood children revealed an alarming spectrum of conditions. Beyond the visible physical deformities such as Eleanor's scoliosis, Thomas's cleft lip, and the polydactyly observed in several siblings, more detailed exams revealed even graver internal problems. 6 of the 11 children had congenital heart defects of varying severity. 8 showed impaired kidney function. Nearly all exhibited some degree of cognitive impairment, though the extent varied significantly from child to child. What we observed in the Blackwood case is the effect of so-called inbreeding depression, continues Dr. Roberts. When genetically close individuals have children, the probability of harmful recessive genes manifesting increases drastically. In cases of extreme consanguinity, like siblings over multiple generations, these effects are exponentially amplified. The health system of the 1950s was not prepared to deal with such complex cases. The Blackwood children were distributed among several hospitals and specialized institutions across Virginia, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania, often separated from one another, which added emotional trauma to their already significant physical challenges. Joseph, the firstborn whom Ezekiel had been preparing to continue his distorted legacy, presented the most complex psychological case. Assessments revealed a severely fragmented personality, alternating between periods of lucidity and psychotic episodes. Diagnosed with schizophrenia, he spent most of his adulthood in psychiatric institutions, dying in 1983 at the age of 45. Rebecca, whose brave escape had exposed the case, faced her own challenges. Beyond her hearing impairment, later examinations revealed a cardiac condition that required multiple surgeries. Despite these difficulties, she demonstrated remarkable adaptability. With the support of dedicated social workers, she learned sign language and eventually graduated from high school through a special program. Rebecca became a symbol of hope, comments Marion Foster, one of the social workers who worked with the Blackwood children. Despite everything she faced, she maintained an insatiable curiosity about the world and an unshakable determination to create a better life for herself. Thomas, who survived while his twin brother Timothy died in childhood, perhaps faced the most difficult path. With multiple facial deformities and severe speech problems, he faced significant social rejection, even within institutions created to help him. Medical records indicate he underwent 17 reconstructive surgeries between 1958 and 1970, with limited results. Thomas's case illustrates how the effects of consanguinity extend far beyond the physical, says Dr. Richards. The psychological impact of growing up not only with visible deformities but also with the knowledge of their origin created additional layers of trauma that medical treatments could not address. For the younger children, born in the 1950s, the destiny was equally challenging. Mary, Martha's last daughter, born in 1956, had a rare genetic condition that affected bone development. At age 2, when she was rescued, she could barely sit without support. Subsequent medical evaluations revealed she also suffered from severe visual problems, seeing only figures and basic shapes. Children born in the final stages of this consanguinity cycle had even more severe conditions, explains Dr. Roberts. This is consistent with what we know about prolonged consanguinity. The effects tend to intensify across generations as the genetic pool becomes increasingly limited. The medical history of the Blackwood children became an important case study for the emerging field of genetics at the time. Doctors and researchers, recognizing the scientific value of these cases despite their tragic origins, meticulously documented each condition, creating one of the first comprehensive records of the effects of extreme consanguinity on humans. It's important to understand that in the 1950s, human genetics was still in its infancy, says Dr. Fisher. DNA itself had only been identified as the genetic material a few years earlier in 1944, and its structure was discovered by Watson and Crick in 1953. The Blackwood case occurred at a pivotal moment for genetic science. The information gathered from the Blackwood children contributed significantly to the scientific understanding of heredity mechanisms and the risks of consanguinity. Studies based on their cases were published in medical journals throughout the 1960s and 1970s, always using pseudonyms to protect their identities. Beyond medical challenges, the Blackwood children faced significant obstacles to social integration. Having grown up in extreme isolation, many exhibited severe difficulties with socialization and adapting to basic behavioral norms. Some never developed common, age-appropriate skills, remaining functionally nonverbal despite years of therapy. What we see in the most severe cases among the Blackwood children is the combined impact of compromised genetics and extreme social deprivation, explains Dr. Patterson. It's impossible to completely separate how much of their cognitive and behavioral challenges resulted from genetic factors and how much was a consequence of the isolated and abusive environment in which they were raised. The social assistance system of the 1950s and 60s struggled to properly handle such complex cases. Many of the Blackwood children went through multiple placements, transferred between orphanages, hospitals, and specialized institutions as their needs evolved or when existing facilities proved inadequate. We must remember that this was a time when institutionalization was the standard response for children with significant disabilities, says Dr. Peterson. The models of community integration and family-centered services we consider standard today simply did not exist as viable options. Some of the Blackwood children, particularly those with less severe disabilities, eventually achieved a degree of independence. Eleanor, despite her severe scoliosis, developed exceptional handicraft skills and eventually earned a living creating detailed tapestries, some of which were exhibited in regional folk art galleries. Rebecca, whose escape had exposed the case, perhaps built the most conventional life among all the siblings. After completing her education, she worked as an assistant in a Pittsburgh library for over 3 decades. Though she never married or had children, a decision that, according to her diaries, was influenced by the fear of transmitting troubled genes, she developed a close circle of friends and was known for her involvement in disability rights causes. Rebecca's journey from extreme isolation to a life of her own is remarkable, says Dr. Richards. She transformed her trauma into a commitment to help others, particularly those with hearing impairments. Her diaries reveal someone who spent her life seeking to understand her own story and to use that understanding to create positive change. For others, however, Ezekiel Blackwood's legacy proved impossible to overcome. 4 of the 11 surviving children never left institutional environments, requiring 24-hour care due to the severity of their physical and cognitive conditions. The institutions where they lived reported that even decades after their rescue, some still exhibited severe trauma behaviors, such as rocking their bodies repeatedly or reacting with terror to certain stimuli that triggered traumatic memories. Over the years, researchers and doctors continued to monitor the Blackwood children, always with their consent or that of their legal guardians. This long-term follow-up provided valuable insights into how the effects of consanguinity and prolonged trauma evolve throughout a lifetime. What we learned from following the Blackwood children was that some conditions tend to worsen with age, explains Dr. Roberts. For example, heart problems that were manageable in youth often became more severe in middle age. Several of them developed kidney failure at relatively young ages, requiring dialysis or transplants. The life expectancy of the Blackwood children proved to be significantly reduced. Of the 11 rescued in 1957, only 3 lived beyond the age of 50. Most died from complications related to the congenital conditions that were exacerbated by aging. Every body system was somehow affected by the consanguinity, continues Dr. Roberts. Compromised immune systems made them more vulnerable to infections. Metabolic problems made regulating blood sugar difficult. Bone deformities often led to early and severe arthritis. It was as if they aged at an accelerated rate. Rebecca, the most resilient of the group, was also the one who lived the longest. She died in 2010 at the age of 71 from complications related to congestive heart failure, a condition she had managed for decades. Her diaries, which span more than 60 years, were donated to the University of West Virginia, where they constitute a valuable archive for researchers in genetics, psychology, and history. Rebecca's diaries are extraordinary, says Dr. Peterson, who helped catalogue the collection. They document not only her own journey but also offer a unique perspective on the evolution of social and medical understanding of disability throughout the second half of the 20th century. She watched and commented on how attitudes towards people like her and her siblings changed over time. The Blackwood genetic legacy extended beyond the first generation. Although most of the children never had children of their own, whether due to infertility resulting from genetic conditions or personal choice, 3 of them eventually formed families. Eleanor had a daughter, Sarah, with a man she met through a community arts program. Sarah was born in 1968 and, while she had no significant physical deformities, was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in adolescence, a condition some researchers suggest may be related to the compromised genetic inheritance. When we talk about consanguinity, the effects can persist for generations, even after new genes are introduced into the family pool, explains Dr. Fisher. This is because many harmful recessive genes can remain in a heterozygous state without manifesting phenotypically, but are still present and can be potentially passed on. Michael, Martha's 6th son, had 2 children. Both were born with a mild intellectual disability, though significantly less severe than their fathers. One of them also developed type 1 diabetes in childhood, another condition that can have genetic components. The grandchildren of the Blackwoods represent an interesting case of how the effects of consanguinity can be diluted but not completely eliminated in a single generation, says Dr. Roberts. They tended to have less severe conditions, but they still carried a genetic load that made them more vulnerable to certain diseases and conditions. The Blackwood case continues to be studied by modern geneticists who now have access to tools and understanding unimaginable in the 1950s. Samples of preserved DNA, collected with consent during medical examinations over the years, have recently been analyzed using advanced genomic technologies, revealing with unprecedented accuracy the specific mechanisms by which consanguinity affected the family. What we are discovering now with modern genomic analysis is that the impact of consanguinity on the human genome is even more complex than we imagined, explains Dr. Fisher. It's not just about individual genes, but how whole gene systems interact. The Blackwood case is helping us map these pathways, which may eventually benefit our understanding of rare genetic diseases in general. In the Appalachian Mountains, memories are long, and stories persist through generations like the fog between the valleys. More than 6 decades after the discovery of the Blackwood family, the echoes of that tragedy continue to reverberate, both in the region where it occurred and in the broader scientific and social understanding of consanguinity. The Blackwood property, that scene of horror for nearly 2 decades, stood abandoned for many years after the children's rescue. The local community, deeply impacted by the revelation of horrors so close to home, seemed reluctant to approach the place. The main house eventually collapsed under the weight of years of neglect, and the forest gradually reclaimed the small huts that once sheltered the Blackwood children. There was a feeling among the locals that this place was somehow stained, explains Harold Jenkins, a local historian born in 1945 who has spent his life documenting the history of McDowell County. It wasn't superstition in the conventional sense, these were practical people, but there was a tacit consensus that that land should be left in peace, as a form of respect for the victims. In 1972, the same year Ezekiel Blackwood died in prison, the county finally took possession of the property due to unpaid taxes. After considerable debate about what to do with the land, it was decided to turn it into a small nature reserve. Today, the Hope Springs Memorial Park occupies the site, with hiking trails and picnic areas. A small, discreet plaque at the entrance acknowledges the dark history of the place, dedicating the park to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of extreme adversity. For the local community, the Blackwood case represented a significant inflection point. The intense scrutiny from the national media that followed the family's discovery forced a re-examination of the practices and attitudes that had allowed such a situation to persist for so long without intervention. The unspoken code of not interfering in the affairs of others, which was so strong in the rural Appalachian communities, began to be questioned, says Dr. Peterson. People began to recognize that there was a difference between respecting privacy and ignoring signs of abuse. It was a significant cultural shift that eventually led to stronger community networks for protecting children and vulnerable families. In the decades that followed, several local initiatives emerged in direct response to the case. In 1965, a mobile health clinic began operating in the region, bringing basic medical care to remote communities. In 1978, the Rebecca Blackwood Center for Children with Special Needs was established in Charleston, West Virginia, offering specialized services for children with multiple disabilities. The name of the center was deliberately chosen, explains Margaret Wilson, one of its founders. We wanted to honor Rebecca's courage and transform a story of horror into something positive. The center became a symbol of how communities can learn from past tragedies and create better systems of care and protection. In the field of genetics, the Blackwood case continued to influence research and clinical practices. The data collected from the Blackwood children and their descendants was incorporated into broader studies on consanguinity and its effects, contributing to the development of better genetic counseling tools and prenatal diagnosis. Advances in genetics in the decades following the Blackwood case have transformed our ability to understand and mitigate the risks associated with consanguinity, explains Dr. Roberts. Today, we can identify harmful recessive genes and offer options like in vitro fertilization with pre-implantation genetic testing for at-risk families. These technologies were unimaginable in Ezekiel's time, but were partly built upon knowledge gained from cases like his. The history of the Blackwoods also found its way into educational curricula, particularly in courses on medical ethics, social work, and genetics. Stripped of the sensational elements that dominated media coverage at the time, the narrative now serves as a powerful case study on the intersections between social isolation, abuse of power, and genetic vulnerability. When I teach the Blackwood case to my social work students, I emphasize how multiple systems failed these children, says Dr. James Wilson, a professor at West Virginia University. It wasn't just the absence of adequate social services in rural areas, but also cultural norms that discouraged intervention, gaps in child protection legislation, and a limited understanding of the signs of family abuse. It's a powerful lesson on the need for comprehensive approaches to child protection. For the few direct Blackwood descendants still alive, the family history remains a complex legacy they continue to navigate. Sarah, Eleanor's daughter, now 57, has become a vocal advocate for greater education about the risks of consanguinity and the importance of genetic counseling. "My mother never hid from me where I came from," Sarah shared in a rare 2005 interview. "She believed I had the right to know my story, no matter how painful. That knowledge allowed me to make informed choices about my own life, including the decision not to have biological children due to the continued genetic risks." Michael Blackwood's children, the only other known direct descendants, have chosen to maintain a lower profile. Both legally changed their surnames in adulthood and rarely discuss their connection to the case. This decision to distance themselves reflects the complex issues of identity and stigma that continue to affect families with histories of consanguinity, even generations later, says Dr. Richards. The stigma associated with consanguinity remains powerful in our society. For the Blackwood descendants, there is the additional challenge of being connected to a case that has become almost legendary in its notoriety. The decision to embrace this history, as Sarah has done, or to distance oneself from it, as Michael's sons have chosen, represents different but equally valid coping strategies. Rebecca Blackwood, in her final diaries written shortly before her death in 2010, reflected on the long-range effects of Ezekiel's actions. "Sometimes I think what my brother did was like throwing a stone into a lake. The stone sank long ago, but the waves keep spreading, affecting people he never knew and will never know. I hope that in time, these waves carry not only pain but also wisdom. That our story serves as a warning, and perhaps as a catalyst for change." Her wish seems to have been fulfilled in many ways. The Blackwood case contributed to significant reforms in child protection legislation, advances in the genetic understanding of consanguinity, and greater social awareness of the dangers of extreme isolation. A story of unimaginable horror has, over the decades, become a source of knowledge that has potentially prevented similar tragedies. When we look at the legacy of the Blackwood case today, we see both the tragic consequences of isolation and abuse and the potential for healing and positive change, concludes Dr. Peterson. It is a reminder that even the darkest stories can eventually shed light on pathways to a better future. In 2018, 60 years after the family's initial discovery, a small memorial was erected in the cemetery where several of the Blackwood children were buried over the years. The simple bronze plaque does not mention the consanguinity or the specific horrors they faced, but carries a powerful message, in memory of the Blackwood children. May their lives teach us compassion, vigilance, and the responsibility we have toward one another. In those same Appalachian Mountains where Ezekiel once ruled his small kingdom of terror, communities now work actively to break the cycles of isolation that so long defined the region. Social outreach programs, better roads and infrastructure, and a growing awareness of the importance of community connections, have helped transform areas that were once cut off from the outside world. However, experts warn that the conditions that allowed the Blackwood case, extreme isolation, persistent poverty, and a lack of access to education and social services, still exist in pockets across the country. The Blackwood case should not be seen as a historical aberration that could not happen today, warns Dr. Wilson. While we,